Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're taking a closer look at the life and legacy of Jesus.
A fascinating figure, to say the least.
Absolutely. And what really got me intrigued about this one was our listeners' requests. They're not just interested in the basic facts, but also all those historical debates surrounding Jesus.
Oh yeah, those debates can get pretty intense.
For sure. So we're starting with the Wikipedia article on Jesus. Seems like a pretty solid foundation, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. It's a great resource, really comprehensive, and it highlights how much of an impact Jesus has had throughout history.
Totally. And one thing that jumped out at me right away was the whole genealogy thing.
Oh yeah, that's always a fun one.
It is, because, Matthew traces Jesus's lineage back to Abraham, emphasizing that kingly line. But then Luke goes all the way back to Adam, connecting Jesus to, well, everybody, all of humanity.
Hmm. It is interesting, isn't it? It kind of suggests that each gospel writer might be emphasizing different things about who Jesus was and what his mission was all about.
That's a good point. So, for Matthew, writing for a Jewish audience, he might be highlighting Jesus as fulfilling prophecy, the king of the Jews, right?
Exactly. That makes a lot of sense.
But then what about Luke? What's his take on it?
Well, he was writing for a more Gentile audience.
Mm.
So maybe he's focusing on Jesus's universal appeal, that connection to all of humankind.
Right, right. A subtle difference, but definitely significant.
Definitely. It shows how early Christians already had diverse ways of understanding Jesus.
Speaking of understanding Jesus, what about those lost years? That period between his childhood and when he started his ministry? Anything in those missing years that could give us clues about how he developed?
That's a period that sparks a lot of theories for sure.
Oh, I bet.
Some scholars believe he may have traveled, possibly even to India or Egypt, coming across all sorts of different spiritual traditions.
Wow. That'd be quite the journey.
Others think he might have been studying with the Essenes, those communities known for their, super strict practices and mystical beliefs.
Yeah. It's like we're missing a piece of the puzzle.
Exactly.
But then, boom, around 30 years old, he shows up, gets baptized by John the Baptist, and his public ministry takes off.
And that baptism, that's a key moment.
Yeah.
One of the most widely accepted historical facts about Jesus, actually. It marks the start of his public life, sets the stage for his ministry.
It's like a turning point.
It is a big transition,
Yeah.
a conscious choice to step into a new role.
Okay, so baptized and then straight into the wilderness for 40 days of temptation. What was the point of that? What was he wrestling with out there?
Well, you got to imagine it was a time of serious inner struggle, right?
Yeah, intense.
He's confronting his desires, his doubts, his fears, all that. It's like this powerful metaphor for the internal battles we all face, choosing between good and evil, following our ego or our higher purpose, that kind of stuff.
Like a hero facing their demons before the real adventure begins.
Yeah, exactly like that.
And speaking of adventure, his ministry was full of, pretty remarkable events.
Oh, yeah. Teaching, healing, performing miracles.
Yeah, it's pretty dramatic stuff.
It is. It is. And those miracles, they're really interesting. They're at the heart of his message and his authority. But they also raise all sorts of questions about how we're supposed to interpret them.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, were they literal events? Or maybe
But
symbolic acts? Or even metaphors for some kind of spiritual change? I'm guessing even within Christianity, there are different schools of thought on that.
Absolutely. There are all sorts of interpretations. And that variety in interpretation really gets to the heart of the debates about Jesus, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. How do you even separate fact from interpretation in all of this?
It's a real challenge, for sure. We have to look at the historical context, consider the different perspectives of those writing the Gospels, and how Christian thought has evolved over centuries. It's like peeling back layers, trying to get to the core of it all.
And all of this is happening during Roman occupation of Judea, right?
Sure.
That's got to add a whole other layer of complexity.
Oh, absolutely. You can't ignore the politics of the time. Jesus was operating within this really complicated socio-political landscape, challenging authority, questioning traditions, and preaching about radical love and forgiveness. It's no wonder he caught the attention of both religious and political leaders.
Yeah, I can see how his message could be seen as subversive, definitely. And the Gospels themselves present different portraits of him, don't they? How do those different portrayals factor into the historical debates?
Well, they give us these fascinating glimpses into early Christian communities and how they understood Jesus.
Oh, I see. So in Mark, for instance, he's this dynamic miracle worker, like a divine figure whose actions show God's power.
Exactly. Then you've got Matthew portraying him as fulfilling Jewish prophecy, the Messiah, the King.
So each gospel has its own focus, its own lens for presenting Jesus.
Exactly. And then there's Luke, who emphasizes Jesus's compassion, his care for the poor and
And
marginalized.
then John, right. He goes for a more mystical portrayal.
Yeah, John focuses on Jesus's divinity, his identity as the Word of God made flesh.
Okay, so even within those core texts, we've got these different perspectives.
No wonder there's so much debate about who Jesus really was and what he represents.
Yeah, and it's a testament to the power of his story and his message. This is a story that continues to challenge us, inspire us, and make us think deeply about ourselves, about our relationship with the divine, and our place in the world.
Now, we can't move on without talking about his teachings.
Yeah.
What are some of the main themes that come up in his parables and sermons? What was he trying to get across?
Well, his parables are especially insightful,
Oh, yeah, they're great.
brilliantly crafted stories with these deeper layers of meaning. And they often challenge the conventional wisdom and social norms of the time, like take the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right. It challenges us to think differently about who our neighbor is, to see beyond social divisions and prejudices.
It's a timeless message, especially relevant in today's world. What other teachings stand out to you? His teachings on forgiveness and love. They're really central to his message. He constantly talks about the importance of loving your enemies, turning the other cheek, and breaking free from those cycles of violence and revenge.
That's a pretty radical idea, challenging us to change how we see the world and each other. And that leads us to a pretty crucial moment, his decision to go to Jerusalem.
Ah, yes, to the holy city, the center of religious and political power.
It's a risky move, right?
Absolutely. It's deliberate and dangerous. He knows what's waiting for him there, but he goes willingly.
Like walking right into the lion's den. He's challenging the heart of the establishment. What happens when he arrives? What's the reaction?
Well, he enters the city on Palm Sunday, and he's greeted by these cheering crowds who see him as a potential liberator, a messiah who will free them from Roman rule.
Hmm.
But things escalate quickly. His actions and teachings become more and more provocative. He's challenging the religious authorities, disrupting the status quo.
And that leads to one of the most dramatic events in his ministry, the cleansing of the temple. It's interesting how the Gospels put it at different points in his ministry. What's the significance of this event? What's the message he's sending?
Oh, it's a powerful statement, that's for sure. It shows how much Jesus valued true worship and how much he condemned hypocrisy and corruption, especially within the temple itself.
Yeah, it's pretty intense.
He flips over the tables of the money changers, accuses them of turning his father's house into a den of thieves. I mean, that's a direct challenge to the religious establishment.
Definitely not holding back.
Nope. And it really sets things in motion, leading straight to his arrest.
It's like a turning point. Things start spiraling from there.
Exactly. And then you got the Last Supper. Such a symbolic and poignant event.
Yeah, that one always gets to me.
Jesus shares this final meal with his disciples. He washes their feet, institutes the Eucharist, that ritual of bread and wine representing his body and blood.
Oh, the Eucharist. I've
Mhm.
always found that so fascinating, such a central ritual in Christianity, but with all sorts of interpretations, right?
Absolutely. Lots of different layers of meaning there.
Can you give us a rundown of how various Christian traditions understand the Eucharist?
Sure. So some denominations see it as a literal transformation, like
Mhm.
the bread and wine actually become the body and blood of Christ. Others see it more symbolically as a representation of his sacrifice and presence.
Right, right.
And then there's also a whole spectrum of interpretations about what it means to actually participate in the Eucharist.
Yeah, like what's the significance of taking part in that ritual?
Some emphasize it as a way to receive forgiveness for your sins. Others focus more on the communal aspect, how it unites believers as they remember Christ's sacrifice together.
So even within that one ritual, you've got this whole tapestry of meaning and interpretation.
Exactly. It speaks to the depth and complexity of Christian thought,
For sure. And then after the Last Supper, we see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane wrestling with what he knows is coming.
Yeah, that's a heavy scene. He's praying to his Father, pouring out his anguish, asking for the strength to face what's ahead.
It's such a human moment. We see his vulnerability, his emotional depth.
Absolutely. And what about the disciples? How do they react to all of this? Are they supportive or are they totally lost?
Yeah, good question. I mean, are they with him or against him?
Well, the Gospels portray them as this mix of loyal but flawed people,
Oh, that makes sense.
devoted to Jesus but struggling with their own doubts and fears,
Huh.
and even a little ambition mixed in there.
Yeah, just trying to make sense of everything.
Right. Like in the Garden of Gethsemane, they fall asleep while Jesus is praying. Not exactly the emotional support he needs in that moment.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's rough.
And then, of course, you've got Judas, who betrays Jesus to the authorities. It's this heartbreaking act, and it really highlights how people are capable of both incredible loyalty and deep treachery.
It's a stark reminder that even those closest to Jesus weren't perfect. So then comes the arrest, and then that whole series of trials. What can you tell us about those?
Oh, the trials are fascinating. So much going on there. First, Jesus is brought before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish authorities, where they accuse him of blasphemy.
Right, right. And then what?
Then he's taken to Herod. He was the Roman-appointed ruler of Galilee. Herod seems more curious than hostile, almost like he's just intrigued by Jesus. But finally, Jesus ends up in front of Pontius Pilate.
Ah, Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, the one with the power to condemn him to death.
Exactly. And Pilate's role in all of this is so interesting. He seems almost hesitant to condemn Jesus, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. Why do you think that is? What are some of the theories about his motives?
Oh, that's a question that's been debated for centuries.
I bet.
Some historians think Pilate saw Jesus as this harmless religious guy, no real threat to Rome.
Right, just someone stirring up a bit of trouble.
But others think he might have been under pressure from the Jewish leadership. They saw Jesus as a dangerous rebel, someone who needed to be dealt with.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
And then there are those who argue that Pilate was just a politician, focused on keeping things under control and avoiding any kind of uprising.
So playing it safe, basically.
Exactly. It was probably a mix of all those factors. But whatever his reasons, his decision to condemn Jesus to death has had a huge impact on history.
It's amazing how those smaller details, like the motivations of one person, can have such far-reaching consequences.
It really is. And then we come to the crucifixion itself. Such a brutal and agonizing way to die. A punishment reserved for the worst criminals.
Yeah, hard to even imagine.
The Gospels describe the horrific details of Jesus' suffering, but they also emphasize his incredible strength and his message of forgiveness, even in the midst of all that pain.
You requested this deep dive because you wanted to understand the historical debates around Jesus. So how does the crucifixion, as it's described in the Gospels, fit into those debates? What are some of the ways scholars have interpreted this event?
Well, some scholars focus on the historical context, analyzing the political and social dynamics that led to Jesus' execution.
So looking at the bigger picture, the forces at play.
Exactly. They see it as a result of Roman imperial power and the clash between Jewish religious authorities and this charismatic leader who challenged their authority.
So a consequence of the power struggles of the time.
Right. Then you've got others who interpret the crucifixion through a theological lens.
Focusing more on the religious meaning, the symbolism.
Exactly. They see it as fulfilling prophecy, a necessary sacrifice to redeem humanity. And there are also interpretations that emphasize the psychological and spiritual aspects of the event, focusing on Jesus' suffering, his message of forgiveness, and his triumph over death.
It's amazing how one event can have so many layers of meaning and interpretation. It speaks to the power of that symbol and how much the Jesus story continues to fascinate people.
It really does. And then, of course, we have the resurrection, that central event in Christian belief. What are your thoughts on that, knowing that you're specifically looking at historical perspectives?
Well, from a historical standpoint, the resurrection is obviously the most debated part of the story. The Gospels talk about the empty tomb, the risen Jesus appearing to his disciples, and his ascension into heaven. But how are those accounts interpreted both by Christians and those outside of Christianity?
That's where things get really interesting. Within Christianity, the resurrection is generally understood as a literal bodily resurrection. It confirms Jesus' divinity, his victory over death. It's the foundation of Christian faith and hope.
Yeah, makes sense.
Outside of Christianity, there's a wider range of interpretations. Some see it as a metaphorical or spiritual resurrection, emphasizing the transformative power of Jesus' message, but not necessarily a literal physical event. Others view it as a legend that developed over time as the Jesus movement evolved.
So even that central event, the resurrection, is open to debate and interpretation.
Absolutely.
It seems like trying to understand Jesus, both historically and theologically, is a journey that never really ends.
It is, and that's part of what makes it so captivating. There's always more to uncover, more to think about, more to discuss.
Now, you mentioned wanting to explore how different religions view Jesus. We've talked about Christianity, but what about other faiths? What role does he play in their belief systems?
Oh yeah, that's important. Islam, for example, recognizes Jesus as a prophet.
Okay, so he's acknowledged within Islam as well.
Definitely. They believe he's born of a virgin, performed miracles, but he's not considered divine. And the crucifixion is understood differently. The belief is that God raised Jesus up to heaven and someone else was crucified in his place.
It's fascinating how different faiths can interpret the same figure in ways that align with their own core beliefs.
It really is. And it highlights how important it is to have dialogue and understanding between different faiths. Even though they might have different interpretations of Jesus, they can still find common ground in his teachings on love, compassion, and justice.
Speaking of different interpretations, what about the Christ myth theory? You mentioned it earlier. Can you break that down for us and explain why scholars don't generally accept it?
Sure. The Christ myth theory basically proposes that Jesus didn't actually exist, or that he was this composite figure based on various mythical archetypes.
So, more of a symbolic figure than a real person?
Yeah, something like that. But while it's an interesting theory, it's not really supported by mainstream scholarship. Most historians and biblical scholars agree that Jesus was a real historical figure who lived in first-century Palestine.
So, despite the debates and varying interpretations, there's a general consensus that Jesus did walk this earth.
Yes, that's the prevailing view. And even though the Christ myth theory isn't widely accepted, I think it raises a good point. We should always be open to questioning our assumptions and considering different perspectives.
Absolutely. It's about thinking critically and engaging with the evidence, even when it challenges our existing beliefs.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the core of this deep dive, your desire to understand the historical Jesus and all the debates surrounding him.
Right. After covering all of this, where do we stand? What can we say with some confidence about who Jesus was and what he stood for?
Well, despite the challenges of sorting through ancient texts and conflicting accounts, more and more historians are coming to agree that Jesus was a real person who lived in first-century Palestine. He was a Jewish preacher and healer who attracted a large following.
Okay, so we can place him in a specific historical context.
Right. And he challenged the religious and political authorities of his time, and ultimately he was executed by the Romans.
So a Jewish preacher who lived, taught, and died in a specific historical setting. But then there's the question of his legacy. How did this one man, living in this relatively obscure part of the Roman Empire, come to have such a profound impact on world history?
That's the big question, isn't it? The million-dollar question. And I think it comes down to the power of his message, the enduring appeal of his teachings on love, forgiveness, and compassion.
Those themes definitely resonate with people across cultures and time periods.
Absolutely. And of course, for Christians, his death and resurrection are central to their faith.
Right, right. We've explored so much in this deep dive. The historical debates, the theological interpretations, the different ways Jesus has been portrayed, and the lasting impact of his story. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you think is crucial for understanding Jesus and his impact on the world?
I think it's important to remember that the Jesus story is, at its heart, a human story. It's a story about love and loss, about betrayal and sacrifice, and about hope. It speaks to people across cultures and time periods because it taps into our deepest longings and fears, our search for meaning and purpose, and our desire to connect with something bigger than ourselves.
That's beautifully put. It brings us back to our listener's request, wanting to understand not just the facts about Jesus, but also the deeper meaning, the historical complexities, and the lasting impact of his story.
Yeah, and I hope this deep dive has provided some food for thought, some fresh perspective, some aha moments along the way. It's all about asking questions, engaging with the material, and ultimately forming your own understanding of this incredible figure who continues to shape our world.
Wow, that's a really great question. You know what? For me, it's that tension between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
Like, how do we reconcile this guy walking the dusty roads of Galilee with this divine figure worshipped by billions?
It's a mystery. It keeps me thinking, it keeps me challenged.
That tension between those two is something that I've been grappling with as well throughout this whole deep dive. It seems like the more we learn about Jesus, the more questions pop up.
Exactly.
It's like peeling an onion, you just keep finding more layers.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of it, right? It's a never-ending journey. You keep exploring, you keep discovering. There's no single answer. And I think that's what keeps the story of Jesus so relevant, so compelling, even today.
You requested this deep dive because you wanted to understand the historical debates surrounding Jesus. So what are some of those debates that you're still pondering? What's really resonating with you?
Well, those discrepancies in the genealogies we talked about earlier, they're definitely still on my mind. It's fascinating to think about how Matthew and Luke might have been shaping their narratives to emphasize different parts of Jesus' identity.
Right. And what about those lost years, that period where we don't have a lot of information? Do you think there's anything we can glean from that silence, or is it going to remain a mystery?
I think there's always room for a little bit of speculation, right? It's fun to imagine what Jesus might have been up to during those years. But in the end, I think the silence speaks volumes. It lets us focus on the message on his teachings rather than getting caught up in the biography.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Shifting the focus from who Jesus was to what he represents, what he stood for. And what about the miracles? Are you leaning more towards a literal interpretation or a more metaphorical one?
To be honest, I'm still kind of wrestling with that one. I
Yeah.
can see both sides. On the one hand, the idea of literal miracles, it's awe-inspiring. It points to this power beyond what we can grasp. But then seeing them as metaphors for spiritual transformation, that's powerful too. It's meaningful.
I think it's okay to hold both of those possibilities in mind. Acknowledge the mystery, the ambiguity. It's not always about finding those black and white answers. It's about engaging with the questions, letting them deepen our understanding.
Absolutely. And I think that's something we can all take away from this deep dive into the world of Jesus. It's a journey of exploration, a quest for understanding that's probably going to continue for the rest of our lives.
And as we continue on that journey, it's good to remember that Jesus' story, it's not just a historical record. It's had such a huge influence on art, literature, music, even culture over the centuries.
It's a story that keeps inspiring and challenging us, making us think about our own lives, our values, and our beliefs.
So to our listener who requested this deep dive, I hope this exploration has given you a better understanding of Jesus, both as a person in history and as a figure of faith. We really encourage you to keep digging into this, to explore the sources, to consider all sorts of viewpoints, and to ultimately come to your own conclusions.
And remember, there's no right or wrong answer here. The beauty is in the journey, the ongoing quest for meaning and understanding.
Thank you so much for joining us on this fascinating deep dive into the world of Jesus. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, keep those questions coming and keep exploring the world with an open mind and a sense of curiosity to